the end of the Castro dictatorship.
Exiles speak out in Miami about Cuba's future, but the Castro regime shuts down a similar open mic event in Havana.
Crackdown in Cuba in the face of the president and his plan to renew diplomatic relations. So what happens now?
Same-sex marriage is a go. Marriage licenses will be issued in the Sunshine State on Tuesday and maybe even sooner. We will take it up with the roundtable. Good morning. Glad you could join us. Gay couples in Miami-Dade could get married as soon as tomorrow if Judge Sarah Zabel lifts her stay.
So many moving parts to what many consider the civil rights issue of our time. But we begin today with human rights and the developments in Cuba that have huge implications for South Florida.
This week, the Castro government halted a public event there, like this one in Miami, which was held to show solidarity with Cuban human rights advocates on the island, but the Cuban state security rounded those guys up.
And these right here are images from what was supposed to be that gathering in Havana. The State Department condemned the crackdown, but did not telegraph action, nor what impact it might have on the new U.S.-Cuba policy the president announced last month.
We want to talk about it with our guest this morning. James Cason is currently the mayor of Coral Gables. Before that, he was a career U.S. diplomat. He served as the head of the U.S. Interest Section in Havana from 2002 to 2005, essentially our ambassador to Cuba.
Dr. Jorge Duaney is director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University and is a professor of anthropology.
And joining us now via Skype from the Dominican Republic is Carlos Saladrigas of Miami, a businessman who was the founder of the Cuba Study Group, a network of Cuban-American business executives who have been seeking to forge closer ties between exiles abroad and Cubans on the island. And Carlos, good morning. Let's begin with you. How are you?
Good morning, Mike. For asking.
Well, we're glad to have you via Skype. I know you are at a second home you have in the DR. First of all, let me just get your general reaction. The president on December 17th announced this new relationship, which you and your group have been pushing for. But then here 2 weeks later...
I think it was a positive move. I think the president changed the dynamics of 50 years of nothing moving. He laid bare Cuban government and their their behavior across the world, and I think he made a major strategic move by making it easier for Cuban civil society and for the rest of the world to bring pressure on Cuba to change its ways.
Well, it certainly is a new day, we believe, but Jim Cason, you spent those 3 years in Cuba as the head of our interest section. And you see that the first test, it would appear, of any kind of a free society or a freer society in Cuba, it failed.
And I think it was inevitable that it would fail. I think that the Cuban government has made it clear that human rights is not something that they want to discuss. They don't believe they have a human rights problem. We tried to discuss human rights when I was there from 2002 to 2005, and they would go into tirades. So I think it's something that they are going to continue to maintain their repression, their system of their political system, and no matter what anybody with the United States or anybody else tries to do, they're not going to change. I think it's unfortunate, but that's the reality.
You know, the timing of this, Dr. Duaney, does this just seem like a slap in the face to President Obama?
I think it is bad timing, and I think it was something that Tania Bruguera, the performance artist who was detained in Havana, took into consideration. She wanted to show that there were limits to the new kinds of relationships between Cuba and the United States, and in fact, she claimed that her performance, even though it wasn't staged at the Square of the Revolution, had been a success because it showed how little the Cuban government really was willing to tolerate dissidents and public opinion.
You know, she actually applied, according to an article she wrote, she applied for permission to stage this and was denied. So she knew going in that this was going to be something bigger, a spectacle bigger than she might have if she had gotten permission for it. Was this an example she was trying to show?
I think it's probably an example showing that let's see a few days after the announcement what they're going to do in the way of human rights or opening up at all. I understand also that the Europeans want to discuss human rights in the next couple days, and that's off the agenda with the Cubans.
Yeah. You know, there have been a lot of things written and said subsequent to the president and Raul Castro's announcement. Here's something that was published the other day in the Washington Post, an editorial. The Post generally perceived as a relatively liberal newspaper, but they have been extremely critical. Here's what the Post said. Cubans who seek basic freedoms continue to be arrested, harassed, and silenced while the regime celebrates what it portrays as victory over the United States. If support for the Cuban people and American values is supposed to be the point in the process, then it is off to a very poor start. Carlos Saladrigas, that's what a liberal newspaper says. Are they right or are they wrong?
Well, it was a conservative writer within a liberal publication, but that's neither here or there. The fact of the matter is that most human rights experts, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and many others, believe that by opening up to Cuba, it makes the work of human rights advocates easier. You know, for years we have tried to silence Cuba, and repression has gone from worse to better. Not that it is what we would like to see, but clearly repression in Cuba today is a shadow of what it used to be 10, 15, 20 years ago. So there has been movement on the human rights issue, not as much as we would like to see, not as much as there should be, but there has been movement. So engaging and putting these issues on the table and the ability to put economic pressure on Cuba requires economic engagement. You cannot put economic pressure if there is no economic engagement. So all these things point to the fact that we are better able to deal with repression in Cuba by engaging than by isolating. Yeah. And I think the example of that has been shown to be true all over the world, especially in Eastern Europe, in the last few days of the Soviet Union collapse.
Carlos, hold your thought for a second. Dr. Duane, we know that one element of what the president proposed was that Cuban exiles can send in now up to $8,000 a year, $2,000 per quarter versus $500 a quarter, to try to help create some kind of market economy for the businesses which are now legal by individuals. But how do you run a business if you can't buy inventory in Cuba?
In fact, President Obama had authorized an unlimited amount of remittances by Cuban American citizens in 2009. The main change now will be that anyone, U.S. citizen of Cuban origin or now, will be able to send up to $2,000 per quarter. I think it might help some of the private businesses in Cuba to, for example, obtain equipment, farm equipment, communications technology, and other items authorized by the new measures announced by President Obama, but it's difficult to see how that sector will thrive in the midst of regulations and control by the Cuban government.
You know, there is, though, their argument that, Jim Kaysen, that Europe is in Cuba, Canada is in Cuba. There are financial investments, there are businesses, and the status quo the government maintains is still there.
I think that's the key. I mean, the president said we're going to do something different, but the interesting thing is that we're the only country in the world that hadn't been doing that for 50-some years. You've had probably 20 million democratic European tourists that have gone to Cuba. I would guess maybe $1 or $2 billion a year from Europe and the rest of the world has gone into Cuba, maybe $100 billion. And the average salary is $20 a month. They've been able to isolate that because they're very much aware that if you get economic freedom, it leads to greater inequality and puts pressure on the government to change the political system. So they're not going to do it.
The theory of the Obama administration, not to do a reductio ad absurdum, is that sort of democracy is the toothpaste in the tube. Once it gets out of the tube, the Castros can't put it back in.
Well, the Cubans have shown for years they're one of the best in the world at an island. They have advantages, but they've been able to make sure that any money that's come onto that island does not trickle down to anybody that they don't want to get it. And the tourists, they put them out into the islands.
That is precisely what is changing now, Michael.
Yes, Carlos.
You know, and this is why Obama took steps to strengthen civil society, as particularly strengthen the small enterprises that are mushrooming in Cuba throughout the country. You know, there are about 400,000 self-employed and small businesses. Many are struggling, but many are thriving under enormous difficulties. And I think a lot of the steps that the president has taken are to strengthen those as part of the building blocks of an essential civil society. I mean, you were right. Democracy and freedoms is like a genie. Once you let it out of the bottle, it's very hard to put it back in. And I think the president understands that. We understand that. And we know, and so did the popes and Pope John Paul II when he called for Cuba and the world to open up to Cuba and for Cuba to open up to the world. We know that openness is the best antidote to repression and to a closed society. And therefore, these measures are going to have an impact on the people, and it is ultimately the people who will have an impact on the Cuban government.
Yet, you know what was so interesting is when the president announced his plan, there were many on the island, especially the dissident community, who were angry that they had not been consulted to be part of this plan.
They're livid. I think that they feel betrayed. They were told over 18 months, many of them went up to see the president, that he would not abandon them. They feel abandoned. And it's not that they don't know about democracy. You've had millions of Cuban Americans going there. They know about democracy. They pick up the telephone and talk to their relatives. They visit. The question is, there's no institutions there that they can work through to bring it about. And these small businesses, we've seen before, when things get good, the Cubans crack down. They've done that two or three times. They're going to control just how far they allow small businesses to prosper.
And we'll follow that thought. I have to say, before we take the break, that part of what's the prompted all the change, at least in Havana, is the falling price of oil. The subsidy from Venezuela has been cut, and I think that Castro was looking for a lifeline, and President Obama threw him one.
A new sugar daddy. They've always lived off of sugar daddies. I mean, you've had the Soviet Union, you had Venezuela, but when things get tough, they look around for a source of money. What they really want is U.S. Loans.
Credits. Yeah,
they want credits. That's
right.
the.
We have to make
Okay.
some money in the next couple of minutes, so take a quick break, and we'll be right back.
On this Sunday morning, we are talking about the so-called new U.S.-Cuba relationship with Ambassador James Kaysen and Dr. Jorge Duane of FIU, and in the Dominican Republic, Carlos Saladrigas. And Carlos, let me ask you, what is the future now of the U.S. embargo that has been in place for, 53 years or so? Does it have a point? Does it have a purpose? Should it be lifted?
I think it should be lifted. I think the embargo has an ironic situation right now. It was a policy that was meant to force Cuba to change. And assuming that Cuba does want to change, it now becomes a major obstacle to change. If we want Cuba to develop a market-based economic system, it cannot do so faced with a U.S. embargo. It cannot implement the major macroeconomic reforms that it needs to implement, and it cannot have a sustainable economy without access to its most logical market 90 miles away. So it is interesting. We want Cuba to change, but our policies does not allow Cuba to change.
But Jim
Something
Kaysen-
has to give here. We either need to provide and facilitate the changes we want to see in Cuba, including economic, political, and human rights, or we put obstacles in the way of change, and that's exactly what the embargo does.
But what
So
practical
it is
effect,
bad policy. It hasn't worked.
Saladrigas, what practical effect does the embargo have when Cuba is supplied with all it needs by more than several other countries?
Look, I've traveled all over Cuba. You find American products everywhere. They got them from the Cologne Free Zone for years. The only thing they really can't get, they can get food, they can get medicine, they can get telecommunications equipment, they can even get newspapers print for grandma. The point is, it's been an excuse. If it weren't for the embargo, they'd have another excuse. The next one will be US $95 billion reparations. Mm-hmm. They're always going to have an excuse, but I don't assume that the Cubans want to change their economy. They've been very clear. We're keeping communism. We're not going to change. You may want us to change, but we will take from the money that you give us and use it the way we want. Of course, most of it right now is going to go to the military. The cigars and the rum, that's all controlled by the military.
Yeah, but Dr. Duane, I mean, what Cuba really wants, obviously, is they deal with the United States right now. They buy hundreds of millions of dollars worth of agricultural products, medical products. Things are all legal to sell to Cuba for cash. what they want are credits, right? I mean, they want to use their credit card.
Sure, credit and also tourism. And the embargo still doesn't allow U.S. Citizens to travel to Cuba just for touristic purposes. At this point, only 12 categories of allowed travel, legally allowed travel, can make it to Cuba: religious, educational, academic exchanges, and so on.
Right.
And the president wants to loosen that up as much as he can under the law. But all of the things that the president has done have been unilateral, and part of the deal was supposed to be 53 political prisoners released
Yeah,
that
where
have
are they?
not yet been
where
released.
are
I think
these prisoners?
even if we find the 53, they've arrested like 8,000 people this year. They've always released people, then they arrest new people. The point is, to the extent that the Cubans want to participate in what the Cubans call the battle of ideas, and if their ideas are not the same of the Castro government, they're going to be arrested. They're going to be put in jail. I don't see any change. Raul said, "Read my lips." We're not changing our system.
He said that the Saturday after the president had
Right.
spoken, 3 days later.
Yes.
So I mean, it would be wonderful if these changes would lead to greater political freedoms. But the Cubans, as I say, have been experts at isolating the inflow of money that's come from all the other countries in the world that have done it, and they've kept it from the Cuban people. They have only like 157 small occupations, and they can change that at any moment. So we can't necessarily expect to see that there's a booming capitalist economy. They're not going to allow it to happen.
Yeah, Carlos Saladrigas, let me just simply ask you, sir. The consensus generally among editorial writers, and I think if you listen to Jim Kaysen and others, is that in this deal between Washington and Havana, Havana got the better part of the deal, and we got bupkis. We didn't get much.
I disagree wholeheartedly with that position. I think we won way more than Havana did. We got to take, to eliminate the great excuse and the source of legitimacy that Havana has always had, being the victim of the U.S. We created enormous damage for President Maduro in Venezuela. We brought back hope to the Cuban people that things have to change, and now the Cuban people are going to start putting pressure on their own government, as we saw over the last few days. So I think we won enormously. We won by helping to build Cuban civil society, by helping to strengthen and have a better dialogue on human rights. We have brought a coalition of nations to push for change in Cuba, where before we were absolutely and totally isolated from the rest of the world.
Carlos,
and besides, the argument that I cannot understand is, while I can understand how people may criticize this new policy approach, how in the world can you defend maintaining the status quo? What did it accomplish in 55 years?
I think the point is that nobody's policy in the world has ever been able to convince these group of 80-year-olds to change. They're not about to change at the age they have. And while their Castros are still alive, there will not be fundamental changes in Cuba. I think the embargo would possibly have been of some use. And I disagree with Carlos that it was designed from the beginning to change the regime. It was designed, first of all, to punish for taking American property. Secondly, it was to keep them money out of their hands when they were expanding around the world with their subversive activities. It would have been nice if it had some effectivity against this regime, but I think that after the Castros are gone, it could have been very useful with the military that controlled the five-star hotels, when you could have said to them, let some dissidents come into a transition government, and we'll let the American bathing suit tourists come to your hotels, and you can privatize them, which is what they want to do.
Well,
It's
that's
going to be the last word
fascinating
today.
thought. Yeah.
Hey, Jim Kaysen, Jorge Duany, thanks so much for joining us. Carlos Saladrigas from the Dominican Republic.
Thank you.
Glad to have
Thank
you with
you.
us this morning, and maybe we get to hear Michael speak a little more Yiddish. My grandma would be so proud. Up next, the roundtable on developments in Cuba, marriage history in the making, and some intriguing South Florida headlines. Stay with us. A new year dawned this week with plenty of new news developments.
And we are taking them to our Powerhouse Roundtable this morning. And with us are Marlon Hill, Miami attorney, civic activist, sometime broadcaster. We're glad to welcome Marlon back.
And welcome back as well to Bernadette Pardo, a veteran South Florida journalist currently broadcasting on WQBA.
and veteran journalist and roundtabler Rosemary Goudreau O'Hara, the editorial page editor at the Sun Sentinel. To all of you, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Happy New Year.
Last roundtable of 2015. Make it good.
Bernie, I have to ask you, I thought that the reaction in Miami to the president's speech about the new U.S. relationship was relatively muted. I don't know what I expected, but I think people were terribly interested, but there wasn't any kind of an outpouring.
I know it was first of all, it came out of the blue, no, and
Right.
secondly, I wrote about this saying it was kind of like being at a wake for 50 years and it's starting to smell bad and you finally bury it. Not only that, but with a papal blessing. So in that sense, from a human standpoint, it's very difficult. If you're, for instance, if you're Miriam de la Peña and you're watching the guy who is the confessed assassin of your son,
Right.
unrepentant.
She was a guest on this
in
program.
the same screen with your president saying, hey, we won, it's not a pleasant thing. But on the other hand, this was not about human sentiments or human suffering. This was about basically real politics. You know, the United States you say it didn't get anything out of it, but think of this, Michael. What brought Cuba to this table was the fact that Venezuela no longer can be the sugar daddy.
Right.
And they're going to go into free fall again. Every time they go into free fall, what happens? We have a mass exodus to Miami.
Right.
I think that for the United States, it's convenient to avoid the free fall.
Well, let me before you jump in here, Rosemary and Marlon, let me sort of say I wasn't exactly expressing my view that the United States got nothing. I think that it was a much better deal for Cuba. But Rosemary, at the Summit of the Americas in April in Panama, I think a lot of the Latin American countries are going to go and be much more willing to go along with ideas from the United States. I think that there will be a very good positive effect on that meeting and on our relationships in Latin America.
Exactly. There were a number of things that this announcement addressed. It didn't address human rights and the ability of people to assemble and speak back to their government, but it did deal with economics. It does improve our relationships in this hemisphere. And as you said, with Venezuela collapsing and with the Soviet sugar daddy long dead and the economy in Cuba not growing at the rate it needs to, the economic pressure. And the other point I would make is that we are now here talking about free speech and democracy in Cuba. And for so many years, it was just it was a non-issue here. So if it helps draw attention to that, and I think the Post was right. It was a bad first step, you know, and
but there are going to be many other steps, Rosemary.
Yes.
You know, and one of the things, Michael, in April in Panama, one thing we tend to forget is that Cuba is still an island nation in the Caribbean. So it's not just the Latin America, it's Latin American and Caribbean policy that will have an impact on this. You remember now you have well over 14 nations from CARICOM that will be also part of this discussion. So I think this move not only impacts two sovereign nations, it will impact the entire hemispheric policy as well.
One of the things that is most intriguing about what the president has proposed is somehow getting Cuba to say, at least we will look at the possibility of taking electronic tablets or cell phones or other electronic equipment into the country, because only 5% of Cubans have internet access.
The key to change in Cuba is 2 stores. If they open an Apple and a Home Depot, that's it. No, I'm serious.
Los Sedanos?
Because this is the middle class that Cuba's lacking, and without a middle class, you cannot have change.
Right.
But you're not going to have change in a country where out of 12 million people, I think 11 million people, 6 million depend on government subsidies, and the other 4 million work for the government and make like, you know, $100 a month.
Right.
How do you transition into a place that has a
especially
middle
with a
class?
population mostly that does not know any other way, that has grown up from birth under that kind of. Let's bring it home a little bit. The big story in Florida, in a matter of hours, possibly the first same-sex marriage licenses set to be dispensed from, could be Miami-Dade, could be Key West, elsewhere. What was very interesting is Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, late night sent a message to Judge Hinkle in Northern Florida that she would not be replying to his order. In other words, Tuesday, no matter what, it's a go. Marlon Hill, the legal eagle on the panel. When have you last seen an attorney not taking any last step to stop something? What does this mean from the Attorney General? She's given up, white flag?
Laying down your sword in following the law. You know, this is a very, very interesting time for us, for all citizens to really pay attention to this branch of government, the judicial branch. This issue of same-sex marriage is a fascinating part of history for jurisprudence. You have several circuit court cases that are still trying to resolve those issues. Judge Sarah Zabel tomorrow morning will be trying to resolve those issues. You have the federal court that is now making its case in Northern Florida in one district, applying to the rest of the state. You have a Supreme Court, mind you, divided the last time they restored benefits under the federal framework to persons, right? 5-4. They have yet to address many issues, Glenna, which we hope in April, June, they're going to hopefully take up some of these split circuit appeals, circuit court of appeals.
Well, same-sex marriage is actually on their list to decide whether to bring up. So
and hopefully that will bring some finality to it. But in the meantime, Florida will be joining almost over 60% of the country now.
36th state.
36th state.
Wow. Yes.
Yeah. Rosemary, let me ask you to respond, since you write wonderful editorials. There remain a group, who knows how large they are, of people, the people who voted for the constitutional amendment 8 years ago that said man is only marriage between a man and a woman. And people who are in that group are saying, look, we voted. We said this was our policy, and now an unelected judge is changing that. What do you say to that person?
Well, it's more than one judge. It's like 5 different judges. As Marlon said, the Supreme Court has weighed in on the federal benefits. You know, we've passed a lot of laws in our country that in the end turn out to not be constitutional.
Right, a black person worth 3/5 of a white person.
Right,
yeah,
or standing in the door, you know, keeping blacks from attending college with whites. And I think that Pam Bondi has done her best to take that argument that people voted for it, that marriage is meant to produce children, that, you know, same-sex marriage will do irreparable public harm. She has made the case as strongly as she could, continues to, because as you pointed out, the Supreme Court has yet to weigh in on the merits of the case. They have not they have not said the stay should stay in place so we can go ahead with these licenses, but they have yet to weigh in on the merits of the case.
Still underway. But the defining point of democracy, I think, is even the will of the majority cannot take away the rights of one person, and that's what you see
And it
judicially
doesn't trump the Constitution, and that's what Judge Hinkle and all the other judges have said is, yes, majority rules, but the Constitution rules everyone.
Equal protection under the law.
Which is what makes this country great,
Does it
in
not?
contrast to Cuba, because it has laws, and the laws evolve.
Right.
And that's the wonderful thing. And also public opinion has really evolved on this.
Oh,
The
it's
path-
changed.
That's a good point.
The path to perfection is filled with many imperfections. So
Shall we
we'll
take
get
a
there.
quick
A
break?
good point on which to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be back.
Welcome back to the Roundtable. Marlon Hill is an attorney, veteran roundtabler as well. Bernadette Pardo, a broadcaster and all-around seasoned journalist, as is Rosemary O'Hara from the Sun-Sentinel editorial page editor. And we are having a discussion behind the scenes that we can now bring forward. A wonderful editorial. You actually broke the story of yet another thing to worry about absentee ballots. Who knew that you could see through the envelopes?
Right. You know, after every election, there is no major glitches, let's turn the page, let's get past it. But there were a number of issues in this last election, and they were little things, but they just pick at the dam. And if you don't pay attention to them, you know, you're going to get a flood. And one was that people can go and pick up absentee ballots in bunches from nursing homes and assisted living facilities or condo social hours. Unless, if you're a paid staffer, you can't, but if you're just a volunteer, you can pick up hundreds. And in Broward, this absentee ballot, you put it in the sleeve, you put it in the envelope, you mail it. But if you hold it up to a light, as one candidate showed me, you could see through the envelope and see who somebody voted for. So it raises the question, if you can see who somebody voted for, should one person be able to pick up hundreds of ballots? How do we know that they're going to turn them all in?
You know, when I read that, I thought, well, who would even think to hold it up to a light? But then, you know, naive.
Yeah.
What did Brenda Snipes, your election supervisor, say about this?
Well, she said that the candidate who pointed it out to me had too much time on her hands, which is not the right answer. Let's identify the problems and deal with it. She said that she was unaware of it, that the sleeve you put your ballot in had writing on, and so she thought that that was sufficient, that she's got enough supplies for the municipal election, so she's going to continue to use that sleeve going forward, but after that she might get new sleeves.
Marlon Hill, Councilor, tell me if I'm wrong, but Miami-Dade County, however, has an ordinance after we had lots of hanky-panky with absentee ballots that I believe it says that only the person voting or a relative can return one absentee ballot. So
it's an immediate family member relative.
Immediate family member. So in Miami-Dade, you can't go to a nursing facility and pick up hundreds of absentee ballots.
I'll have to wait and see if that's true because, you know.
Or if it's enforced.
But you also get free postage in Miami.
Yeah, that's true.
And you can now request your absentee ballot right now and just get it out of the way and get ready for 2016.
I hate voting absentee.
Well, let's talk about 2015. And on Tuesday, Governor Rick Scott in Tallahassee is going to be sworn in for his second term. Marlon, look over the horizon, look toward 2015 and beyond. What kind of things do you expect from Governor Scott?
I think Governor Scott is going to be a little bit more settled. He's now a veteran, two-term governor. He can relax a little bit now. He doesn't need to worry about having to run for re-election.
And he came in as a novice outsider, and he is not and not.
He's not an outsider anymore, and I expect him hopefully to pick up expanding Medicaid, which is an issue that's important to many Floridians.
And he has said he is for it, hasn't done anything to make it happen, but maybe now...
Well, maybe he can pick up the sword. As Pam Bondi puts down one sword, he can pick up that sword and make something happen.
That's a very dull sword Pam Bondi is putting down.
Well, he better sharpen it.
Yeah. What do you think,
Well,
Bernie?
they've got to do something with Medicaid. You have like 900,000 people without insurance that could have insurance. On the other hand, there are problems with the Obamacare and how long will Medicaid, the state Medicaid last. I think in terms of, he also backtracked on immigration during the campaign, and he seemed more amenable to...
Well, he forgot about it. I mean, first he said he wanted the Arizona-style
that was
immigration law, but he got elected, and then to his
now
credit,
it's immigration light. But he has an issue. There is an issue that's coming up, or will come up, whether to give driver licenses to undocumented aliens, which California just did, and which to me makes a lot of sense for many reasons, not just the immigrants.
What do you see his relationship with the legislature? I mean, it's a Republican legislature with its own agenda.
But the Republican legislature helped elect him, unlike the last time when he did it on his own. This time they were right there with him. And I think he went at that point from coming into Tallahassee saying the lobbyists are going to be crying in their drinks to becoming part of the establishment.
Serving the drinks.
Yes. And so as I look forward to his next 4 years, I agree that he's moderated somewhat. He during the campaign talked about more money for education, more money for the environment. I think he'll continue to focus on jobs. Gambling is going to be a big issue because the compact with the Seminoles is up in August. I think public pension reform is a real issue that we're going to see this legislative session. And I do think he's going to be his own man. I mean, one of the issues is, his ability, transparency, government transparency. He hides information. He hides his travel agenda.
Well, that is his continued persona. I mean, he was a CEO all his life. He continues to act like a CEO, but there are things that are in the public domain. I mean, Bernie, in the campaign, he was asked, I asked him, you probably asked him, I know Glenna did.
He never answers.
And, well, all right, but at least we asked him, did you ever conduct any business, state business, on your private email account? He said, absolutely not. Well, campaign ended, and suddenly all these emails were turned over that showed that, in fact, he did do it.
What you gonna do? You know, he's
Send in a records
reelected.
request or two. Yeah.
You'll probably see a little bit more transparency. I'm also hoping to see a little bit more greater diversity on the bench as well. The governor has a lot of sway over that, including the diversity with the judicial nominating commissions as well.
Right.
So because we need a bench and other institutions to reflect the changing demographics. We're now the third largest state
Yes.
in the union.
Right.
Do you
right?
think anybody's going to do anything, given the number of people who voted for medical marijuana? Is anybody going to try to change that law to expand a little bit?
Well, I think that whole campaign is gearing up for yet another round.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
2016, I think, is when
Right.
they are
Yes.
looking at bringing that issue back.
Yeah. You know, before we go, I want to touch real quickly. Monday night, Marlon, you were at this town hall meeting in Miami on gun violence, standing room only. People are so sick and frustrated and tired and angry. And something that came out of that was how truancy is a component of violence on the streets, and how the state legislature funded and then defunded a truancy program. You heard what they were talking about. What was your take on that?
Well, I think it's very important for us to kind of look holistically at what are we doing as a community to prioritize getting rid of violence in these communities. We drive by these communities all the time without any care of what's happening there because it's not impacting our own community.
But it does.
It does.
But it
Right,
does.
I'm gonna have to interrupt. This is a topic worthy of a full-blown discussion,
Thank you,
and
Mike.
we
Yeah,
will
absolutely.
do it again. But thank you all for coming in. It's always great to have you on the roundtable.
Great, thank you.
Always.
All right,
Good to
up
see
next,
ya.
the relationship between a mayor and a felon. It's an investigation by Bob Norman into the towing business in Sweetwater. A convicted fraud artist and his towing company have been working for, of all people, a South Florida police department, and that prompted Bob Norman to ask, hey, how can this happen?
And in a testy encounter, Sweetwater Mayor Jose Diaz defends the city's no-bid towing deal, even after the city commission voted to end it.
But how is it transparent?
Sir,
to
thank you
sign
very
the
much.
contract without it being
My
approved?
doors are open as far as you don't allegate things that you don't know what you're talking about.
So why did Sweetwater Mayor Jose Diaz walk out of our interview? Well, I am trying to get answers. Questions about his city's police towing deal with a company affiliated with this man, Edwin Rodriguez, who has a long rap sheet and was recently convicted in a high-profile fraud case.
They were stealing the money.
People are questioning your relationship with him because he is a convicted felon.
I have no idea what you're talking about. I don't know. He's a convicted felon?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
But Diaz's colleagues on the city commission brought up the felony issue in November and voted to immediately cut ties with the company Rodriguez now manages and is owned by someone named Lesbia Maradiaga, whom city officials say is Rodriguez's mother.
It's his mother, but I mean, there is any Florida statute or any law in the United States that prohibits a son to work for his mother?
The mayor said Rodriguez doesn't personally tow in Sweetwater on police calls, but I obtained surveillance video showing Rodriguez towing a car at this gas station in Sweetwater.
I was told that he doesn't tow within the city jurisdiction because he's a convicted person.
But he does tow within, and we have video
Well, sir,
proving that he tows within.
then you have to report it to the FBI and tell them that we are committing illegal practices in the city of Sweetwater.
Commission President Orlando Lopez, who is running against Diaz, suspects the mayor has a personal relationship with Rodriguez. So I asked Rodriguez about it. Your relationship with the mayor?
I don't even know the guy.
You never.
I've seen
You
him.
never sat down
I
with
don't know
him?
him personally. I don't.
We have witnesses that say you sat down with him
Where did I sit down with him?
in a cafeteria.
I don't know.
Had coffee.
No, no.
You
Sure.
never sat down with him.
No, I never sat down. Not that I recall. I don't.
You don't recall?
No, I don't recall it.
Diaz initially said he never spoken to anyone at AAA before admitting he did meet Rodriguez. You never spoke with anybody at AAA?
No, sir.
You've met Edwin.
I spoke to Edwin, but months after he was hired by the police department.
Witnesses say they've seen you with him at a cafeteria.
Once he came here, and I think we shared coffee over there.
You're not sure if you've spoken with the mayor.
I could have said hi to him. I try to say hi to everybody.
The commission voted on November 3rd to terminate the relationship between the city and AAA. Diaz said he now intends to put the towing contract out to bid, but admitted AAA continues towing for the city despite the ordinance. For This Week in South Florida, Bob Norman, Local 10 News.
Since Bob's reporting, the city of Sweetwater suspended its relationship with AAA Towing and brought in 2 outside towing companies. The vice mayor credits Bob's report for making that happen.
Way to go, Bob. Still to come, my personal perspective about a historic day we are about to witness, and it has been a long time coming. Here is a live look from our Hollywood beach cam. Looks nice out there.
Weather Authority meteorologist Trent Eric has a quick look at the Sunday forecast.
Hello, South Florida. I'm meteorologist Trent Eric. We continue to track a cold front off to the north this afternoon. And as these showers and thunderstorms continue to move closer to Tallahassee, this front is actually going to begin to weaken in the northern part of the state and stall out just to our north on Tuesday, increasing our cloud cover and giving us about a 20% chance of a shower. In the meantime, we'll stay in the low 80s. This afternoon's forecast high 83. Cool down coming, but it'll take a couple of days. So for the rest of your evening out, expect those temperatures to stay mild in the mid 70s.
Trent, thanks. All right, before we leave you this morning, a personal perspective about gay marriage. For a long time, I just didn't give it much thought, but when I did, I was vaguely against it. I thought civil unions provided enough protections and rights for same-sex couples. Well, I was wrong. And I think a lot of Floridians who voted to ban gay marriage 7 years ago see they were wrong too. For the record, I didn't vote for that amendment. The great majority of people in the Sunshine State see now that forbidding people of the same sex to marry is just plain and simple wrong and discrimination and unacceptable. People of the same sex who love each other and are committed to a long-term relationship should have the right to get married. And why not? Who does it hurt if they do? No one. And it benefits the couple by giving them the same legal rights and government benefits that straight couples get. Again, why not? It is the right thing to do. Besides, have we straight people done really such a great job with marriage? Not when roughly half of ours end in divorce. So let's give gay couples a chance to do better. They probably won't, but that's not the point. If you're someone who thinks that 2 people of the same gender being married is immoral or violates the dictates of the Bible, I respect your point of view. I don't agree with it. As a gay friend of mine likes to say, if you don't like gay marriage, don't marry someone of the same sex. In the end, it's about that simple. This entire argument, we should note, could have ended months ago if Attorney General Pam Bondi hadn't been so obstinate and so clueless. If she has the chutzpah to run for governor in 4 years, you might want to remember her shameful record and blocking gay marriage. Rex Scott's record wasn't much better, but hey, this is a time to celebrate for every couple that will soon have the right to marry in our state. Congratulations, Mazel Tov, Felicidades. Marriage equality is finally here. That's my perspective for this week. I hope you have a great Sunday. Remember, as always, stay informed, get involved.
What do you think? We invite you to weigh in on any topic you like. Email, Facebook, Twitter. Here are all the addresses. We are very easy to find. Maybe Michael has a little more Yiddish you want to launch at us before we go? Sei gesund. Have a great Sunday.
Oy vey.